Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining HR podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Christina Luconi. Christina is the Chief People Officer at Rapid7, and we're going to talk about her career, her work, and we're going to get a lot into this conversation. So Christina, let's jump right in. I'd love to have you start with an introduction for the viewers.
Hi, I'm Christina. It's good to be with you here, Lars. What do you want me to include?
Hobbies, favorite colors, favorite travel destination, whatever's on your mind.
Sure. I think of myself as a startup junkie. I've done 6 of them, even though I'm no longer at a startup. But that's we can go down that rat hole at some point. My favorite color is red. And I just went to the Motley Crue concert last weekend, and we'll probably not do that again. How about that?
All right, if we have time, we have to come back to that concert because that sounds like an experience. I just actually watched, not related to Motley Crue specifically, but the Netflix has a special on Woodstock '99 right now. It's a 3-part special. I highly recommend. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's on my list. It looks terrific.
Yeah. So you've spent the majority of your career in HR, and I want to kind of dig into a couple different aspects of that. But just as a starting point, what originally drew you to the field?
Sure. So I was a psychology major. I thought I was going to be some form of therapist. And this is probably a horrible thing to admit about oneself, but I realized like halfway through my degree that I probably didn't want to listen to people talk about their problems all day, every day as a career choice. And my dad was a serial entrepreneur and said, there's this thing called human resources, and it's sort of the intersection of psychology and business. And maybe that's something that you might be interested in. I think what he was really directionally saying was like, kid, you need a job out of college. But what I ended up doing was grew up in Boston, came home for the summer. Kendall Square, which is, sort of Boston's version of Silicon Valley, was just starting to come up and happening, right, with high tech. It had historically just been for MIT. And all these little startups were starting when I was in school. And I joined a high-tech startup that went public about 3 weeks into my internship. And I thought, because I was a naive idiot 20-year-old thinking, oh my gosh, this is the way to go, right? If you get a bunch of smart people working on a problem together, amazing things can happen. And I thought, okay, I want to align around startups. I want to align around HR. I am old enough that when I was getting out of school, HR was new. It had just transferred from, personnel. So people thought HR was this like really newfangled sort of concept. And I was this really annoying kid when I graduated, went into a hypergrowth company, and I was surrounded by people that gave me a lot of space to ask what probably most companies would think were really annoying questions, including, why the hell do we call it human resources? Like, the printer's a resource. If we're trying to scale this thing really quickly, like, it would strike me that we need to have people rowing the boat in the same direction, whatever. What I was really tapping into was culture, even though culture wasn't really a thing talked about then. So that's what drew me to it. And they were, instead of saying, shut up, go file, which they probably should have, they said, why don't you go think about that? Why don't you go explore that? So I was given this unbelievable latitude to test out of a lot of ideas in a very quickly growing company right out of college, I was just in the right place at the right time with some amazing people who fostered that in me. And then there was no other way for me to go. It was just, I was really fortunate.
Yeah. It's so funny how those early moments in your career can set you up on a very kind of unique path based on the environment you're working in. And I think, as you mentioned, you're a self-professed startup junkie, you're a builder, you've seen a lot of, the way that, teams have evolved, growth has evolved, certainly the field of HR has evolved. When you think back to, you mentioned kind of you came in right as, the function was evolving from personnel, right as kind of culture was becoming something that we didn't just kind of talk about, but were kind of thought about consciously crafting and developing to now. And you've seen a lot of change over that time. Like, when you think about like the current state of whatever we want to call it, HR, talent and culture, people operations, not human capital, let's not call it that. But any of the other things that we're going to call it, like, how do you kind of assess the current landscape of the field?
Evolving. I think it's getting better. I mean, it makes me feel good that like people like you exist in the world, because I think there's a lot of people that talk a good game. I think we're still in a situation where there's a lot of people that like to hold up the shingle and say, I'm in people strategy, or I'm in whatever you want to call it. And it's still quite operationally focused, or they'll still say like, I want a seat at the table. I hate that phrase, right? Because I don't think anyone just like gives you a seat at the table. I think you earn that seat. And I think for people in our field, we're in such a prime, amazing opportunity space right now where I could argue you could be one of the most pivotal people in your company if you're strategic in nature and can really focus on what's going to advance the organization. And I think we're on that cusp where some people are doing that, which is phenomenal. I think other people are still stuck in the what's going to not get us, sued, or so compliance driven. And there's need for both, right? I mean, there's a healthy balance, but I think it could be such an exceptional, fulfilling role, both for us, but also for the company, if it continues to evolve in terms of strategic in nature rather than just the tactical stuff. So I think we're headed in the right direction, but not quite there yet.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you kind of frame it that way. Like, I've always viewed the field, and certainly today, as a spectrum, right? And I think that there's a lot of legacy, stigma, punchline, whatever, around like that personnel function of HR, and that function still exists in some companies. But there's some amazing work being done on the other side of that spectrum, and that's all happening simultaneously. And the majority of the field is somewhere in the middle, kind of working to move more towards that progressive side. You've spent your career in startups in Boston. For viewers and listeners that maybe aren't familiar with the kind of tech ecosystem in Boston, how would you explain it?
Thriving, right? I mean, I think I grew up at a time where like everyone started heading to the Bay Area. If you were interested in tech, that's where you would head out west. Excuse me. And I sort of fixated on, this is a pretty amazing community, and you could see things starting to happen, right? And our Kendall Square went from like some tech folks coming out of MIT to like really people investing in this community and building out. And I think it's a different vibe. I mean, like I got plenty of colleagues and friends on the West Coast, but there's something that feels more organic to me about it here. It's not as, there's certainly very competitive people, but you're not just one little drip in the bucket. You can make a pretty significant contribution here, I think. And it's a pretty tight community. I think everyone's really in it to help each other out. Nobody like hangs on to folks, or you can't talk to my people or whatever. I think people have been really amazing in terms of sharing information, sharing knowledge. Even if I just look at the pandemic, the amount of community support for companies just saying, I have no idea what to do right now. What are you doing? And there was a group of maybe 50 people leaders in the Boston community who jumped onto an email chain at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it's still going to this day. And it's, you can opt in or opt out. Some people are on it daily. Some people aren't. I'm not particularly involved in it that much anymore, but it was pretty amazing to see people coming and sharing information and ideas in the spirit of just like, let's all get through this together. And I think that's pretty indicative of the Boston startup community.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, the example you referenced in terms of kind of the beginning of the pandemic, and I mean, none of us have been through anything like that. And so our ability to lean on each other, to lean on our networks, to share and kind of collaborate, I think, we've been moving as an industry from, kind of black box proprietary silos towards more open source practices even before the pandemic. But that was just such a springboard, I think, especially at your level, right? For CPOs and CHROs to really kind of come together and share and kind of help each other through just a, humanity shaping event and everything that's come from it since, right? It's like, that was like the big thing where it's like, nobody's ever dealt with this. And then we've had a series of other things since that were also pretty significant events to help our organizations and leaders and employees navigate through.
Yep. Yep. I agree. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting to watch for me is I loved seeing that community aspect of the pandemic where people like, you're right, none of us had been through any of this before. What do you do? And to be able to rely on people to just checkpoint solutions or things was great. But it's been also really interesting to see who does what with that. I've seen a lot of like, oh, well, so and so did this, therefore I'll do exactly the same thing. And I think that separates amazing people from the general population. For those who like take all the information, but then do what's authentic to their company, as opposed to just so and so did it. I mean, you might have the most brilliant idea and it might work in your organization. It wouldn't work here. I could take the best of it and then edit it to make it work in this environment. But I think people have been so stressed out and so whatever that it's like you take the low hanging fruit and just try to employ it in your company. And I think that can be really dangerous. I think you got to know when to like take the information and then when to make it your own and be really authentic. And that's sort of raising the bar. That's a hard thing for, I think, lots of folks to keep pace with over time.
You know, it's like I've always felt the term best practices was bullshit, you know, for that reason, because I think what makes something a best practice in one organization has so many unique variables within that organization that makes that practice successful. The idea that you can just take that, plug it into any other organization and have the same results is naive and frankly dangerous, because it probably is going to go wrong. And so, like you said, it's like when you can, you know, especially in a world of open source and practices where, you know, you can say, okay, like I like what, you know, Katie Burke is doing at HubSpot. I like what Christina is doing at Rapid7, but a little bit differently. You know, I like, and you can pick different organizations and then you can say, but in our culture, in our organization, with our leadership team, with our employees, with our locations, you know, so all those variables, none of those things will be able to replicate exactly, but I can take this piece from this.
I think that's exactly right. And you just said two things that totally resonated. Like one is Katie Burke is phenomenal. I have massive respect for her. But what she's doing at HubSpot, some of it's great. Like I'll steal it, but some of it would be totally not appropriate in this organization. And knowing those nuances, I think, are really important.
Let's talk about your role at Rapid7 for a moment, because as you mentioned, you've been a serial builder. You know, it's interesting. The market obviously is evolving now as we're in, you know, some level of a down market. To what extent, we don't really know. The job numbers aren't really backing up a lot of the fears we've been told of what might be coming, but we'll see how it plays out. But what is shifting is the role of the CPO, the CHRO, whatever the title might be. You know, over the last 18 months has really, it's been through a lot. Of course, you've been through a lot, but it's seen the value of that position, especially for exceptional talent in that position, has been realized in a way and at a scale that we haven't really seen before. And the demand for people leaders has been astronomical. And so, you know, in that environment, tenures have been shrinking. There's also an aspect of, you know, burnout. People are moving out of the field, getting into coaching, consulting, other disciplines, or just taking time off. You know, but you are, you know, kind of unique in that backdrop in the sense that you've been with the organization for 12 years. And so I'd love to just get your perspective. Like, I'm sure you've had lots of opportunities during those 12 years. What's kept you there?
Corey Thomas, our CEO. I mean, I think, so when I came in here, I every time in between jobs, I'll go back to consulting and sort of do my thing. I love working with startups. And I had come out of a cybersecurity company, Rapid7 cybersecurity company. I come out of another one. When we got bought by Symantec, I reignited my consulting practice, and Rapid7 became a client. And I thought, at the time, we were 75 people. We were talking about selling the company, and I'm like, why would I ever join a company that I know we're going to sell? I mean, that makes no sense to me. And long story short, Corey, who's our CEO, was elevated into that role as I was consulting. And we kind of made a deal. He had been looking around a little bit and knew he wanted to do the CEO thing. Our board promoted him into that role, and we sort of did the I'm in if you're in. And that was when we were about 75 people. And I said, you know, I'm going to stick around until we hit an event. So whether we get IPO or go public or whatever, like I'm in for that first part of the journey. I'll help us get there. And true to my word, like I think the day we filed to go public, I gave them notice. And not for anything that had anything negative to do with Rapid7. It was just like in my mind, I did what I said I was going to do. Now it's time to go do something different. And Corey said exactly what you say to somebody like me, which is like, great job getting us to this place, but get us to a couple thousand people, still have it be an amazing place to work, and then you can take your toys and go home. And I'm like, oh, damn, he's right. And I did. And, you know, candidly, right before the pandemic, I was thinking about, all right, now it's been 10 years, maybe it's time to go do something. At this point, I've been here 3 times longer than I've ever been anywhere in my career. And I'm really, really glad that I stuck around through the pandemic. None of us thought it was going to last 2 years. But in my mind, I thought the worst thing I could do right now is to be selfish and do what works best for me when we've got a company of, I think we were probably, 1,900 people at the start of the pandemic. And they're going to need some kind of stable force. And I'm trying to say that with humility. I'm not like I'm the be all end all, but like I knew that I would be up for the challenge of keeping people motivated and connected when we were going through this craziness. And it turned out 2020, hands down, best year of my career, meaning it forced me to think differently about how I did my job. I am old school enough to believe like FaceTime or human connection is valuable. I mean, this is great. And I know people can be really productive online, but I believe in relationship. And I think it's much easier if you share a meal with someone to really get to know them, to build trust and build relationship. And our company had been built on that. And again, I think there's plenty of amazing things that have come out of the pandemic. I don't think that anyone will ever go 9 to 5 back to work 5 days a week ever in an office, which is nice. I like that people can live a more flexible lifestyle. But I do think that like the wave towards work from anywhere all day, every day makes me really nervous for the future of work, especially for younger people. And that we can go down that path if you want to. But I loved that I was in the middle of trying to figure out how to keep people motivated and focused during arguably one of the most interesting times of our lives.
It's interesting because I do, as you mentioned that, we're recording this, a couple of days after Malcolm Gladwell wrote an op-ed about, the damage of remote work and how people need to be in offices, and that's coming on the heels of memos from Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook and Sundar at Google talking about productivity and really almost making a connection that remote work isn't as productive and that you might need to be in an office to be more productive, which I think a lot of the stats we've seen over the last 2 years has maybe debunked that from a productivity standpoint. From a culture perspective and an innovation standpoint, sure, I think there's actually evidence that says that is based on in-person connections. But I'm curious, like as you see some of these conversations happening, in the environment right now, does that shape or influence at all? I mean, it seems like you've got a pretty firm personal view towards kind of the role of flexibility and remote work. But as you see that swirl around you, does that change or shape any of your thinking?
I listen to everybody, because I like to I'm one of those people, like I definitely have a point of view, but I like to hear what everybody else is thinking. And then I'll edit my point of view based on like some really intelligent points of view. Like you can definitely change my opinion, but I think I'll go back to what I just said, where I think like hybrid's an amazing thing, right? I think it's really nice that people have the ability to like, we have life things, right? Your kid's sick, to not stress that you have to go to an office one day because you have to manage that situation. It's nice for people to have that kind of flexibility. But if I think about younger folks or people that manage people, to never be in person with people, I think it's really hard to build deep, meaningful connections. And that's just life, right? It's like, this is going to be a really bad analogy, I apologize, but it's not dissimilar to dating, right? You could meet someone online that you think is amazing, but if you actually never meet them, it's kind of a bullshit online relationship, right? It's not truly, do you know if you can work through things together, or it's real. It's almost fake and transactional. It can feel good. It could be productive. Maybe you have somebody, but it's not a true, I would argue it's not a true relationship. And people go on like that for a really long time. And I think if you're young, if I look at my own career, if I hadn't been that annoying 22-year-old who was like, hey, the beauty of a startup is your job can go from here to here if you just have a little bit of aptitude and a great attitude and say, I'll help out with that. Who needs help? I got exposure to so many things. I think if you actually want to have a job, sure, work permanently remotely. If you want to build a career and have exposure and have work be a truly meaningful part of your life, I think some amount of it, you can't get away from some amount of in-person connection.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, I think, is where, we're kind of in this environment, and the changes that we've experienced over the last 2 years in HR have also changed how we think about supporting employees and maybe employee expectations, from, mental health support to, flexibility around hybrid or other constructs. And, there's an opportunity for that pendulum perhaps to go a bit too far. And I think, before the whatever level of downturn we're in right now, when the market was on fire, companies were throwing everything at employees or blowing up comp bands to, be able to bring people in. They were throwing off internal equity just to be able to bring in external talent. The demands of that external talent were, astronomical in some cases. And, you were on a panel, we had a chance to catch up live earlier this year, and you were on a panel where, it touched on that topic of like employee expectations and perks and flexibility. And you had a contrarian view on the panel, which I actually appreciated, which is, HR is here to serve the business. HR is here to increase the bottom line of the business, to increase the profitability of the business. And we have to think about our roles as a business function before a function that is just necessarily, creating all of these different, perks and things that can help you attract and maybe retain talent. And I'd love to go deeper with you on that. Like, when you think about the role of HR and your role specifically as an HR leader, as a business leader, helping drive the success of the business through people, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So I'll go back in time. Like when I went to Sapient in 1996, I guess, it was still HR, right? And I thought, if I'm going to come in here and try to build this thing from scratch, we got to think about it differently. And we ended up calling it people strategy. Now, I know that's like a very commonly used thing, but in 96, no one had heard of it. It made no sense. For me, it made a ton of sense, because I viewed my job as to figure out, all right, what is the business strategy of the company? And then how do we work backwards? Because we need to employ the right people strategy to execute that business strategy. That is not rocket science, but I was floored that a lot of people didn't think about it that way. And the term stuck for me. So for me, it's really, I think of myself as a business person first. I just happen to major in people. And excuse me, I try to do the intersection of always every decision that we make is what's in the best interest of the business, what's in the best interest of the customer, what's in the best interest of our people, and try to do that Venn diagram and land in the center. And I think one of the things that I saw during the pandemic, if we keep going back to that, it was that companies, again, there was no roadmap. We were all making it up. But a lot of companies started asking their people first, do you want to come back to work? Do you want to work permanently remotely? I think that was really dangerous, because it's like me asking my teenagers, what do you want? Well, okay, they're going to tell me what they want. It might not be in their best interest long term. But if I say no to that, if I've asked them and then I have to say no, then it's just a lot of friction, right? Whereas I think the approach that we took here on hybrid was, this is where we currently stand. This is why we think some amount of in-person time is really important to the business and to our customers and for your careers. We'll take some feedback on that. Let us know how to make it work best for you. But we came out strong with a point of view on why we thought it was important. before we just, open the floodgates and said, you can do whatever you want to do, because it can't, it is still ultimately a business. So our job is to figure out how are we going to best deliver the business and then make it as humane and motivating to our people as we possibly can. So it's constantly bringing those elements together, which is a lot of work, but I think it's served us pretty well.
I want to go back to a comment you made earlier in the conversation around what's kept you at Rapid7, and you referenced your CEO and the relationship and partnership you have there. And I think within the C-suite, the relationship, especially these days, between the CPO, CHRO, again, whatever the title might be, and the CEO is probably the most, important in the organization, because you're navigating so many things that are impacting people, both internally and externally outside the organization. And so I'd love to get your perspective, for viewers and listeners who are maybe in their first time head of people role, or they aspire to be, or maybe their second time, and they're still, they're still learning about building that relationship with their CEO. What advice would you have for them? What are the keys to building a kind of really successful and trust-based relationship with the CEO?
I think it's different with every person, right? But I think one of the reasons that Corey and I have had such an exceptional partnership is, we complement each other well, right? We've always we shared an office when we were actually in offices. Now we sit out in general population, and we sit, very un-COVID friendly, 3 inches away from each other. And we have for 12 years. And I think there's no secrets, there's no whatever, but I think we realize there is some massive trust there. And I don't think that he has ever thought that I would raise anything or raise a difficult flag without anything but the best intentions for the company, right? I'm not in this for me. I think there's an element of I'm not trying to go anywhere. I'm not trying to take his job. I think sometimes there can be folks on leadership teams that have agendas. We're really lucky. We have an awesome leadership team, but I think he views me as somebody who I'm literally in it for the benefit of the company. It's not about me, it's about us and what are we creating? And we believe that of each other. And we challenge each other. And I'm not afraid of saying he's probably one of the smartest human beings I have ever met in my life. And certainly, that could be intimidating, but he's not perfect. And there are elements where 95% of what he's saying is terrific, but I'm very comfortable saying, but this piece doesn't make sense. And we have to rethink that. And that trust with each other, we have each other's backs on what's in the best interest of the business. That is a really hard thing to manufacture. But I think one of the success features or people that I've seen be really fantastic in this role are those who are willing to run into the fire. We typically have to raise things to the CEO or to the leadership team that other people wouldn't be comfortable raising. Because it's difficult or because it's uncomfortable or whatever. And I don't think we get that latitude. I think our job is to really what's going to be in the best interest of the company. And if you can be that person, I think you become invaluable.
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, that trust piece is so important because, again, you are oftentimes, bearer of news that perhaps, the CEO doesn't want to hear. And you have to kind of be able to leverage that trust to be able to be the truth teller, especially to the CEO and your C-suite peers. One more question I want to get your perspective on before we jump into the lightning round. We've talked about the pandemic, and I think when you look at everything that we've been experiencing over the last 2+ years, from the pandemic to the murder of George Floyd and the conversations that created around social justice and equity, to the January 6th insurrection and the political climate, to Russia's war on Ukraine, there's so many external things that are taking place around the world that are obviously impacting our employees, and they're that's part of the experience that they're bringing to work. And there's a question, and there isn't really a right answer here around what role is it for HR to be communicating in some of these times of crisis. And I would just love to get your perspective. Do you have any kind of litmus test or approach of hey, this is something that we're going to talk about. This is something we're not going to talk about. Like, how do you think about navigating those?
Sure. It's it's a really slippery slope, right? I mean, I think if I go back to the George Floyd stuff, um, you know, Corey happens to be a Black man, and we tend to be fairly left-leaning as an organization overall. And we wanted to say something, but we wanted to be really thoughtful about it and not make it super political. And we ended up, kind of leaning into the Black Lives Matter piece, and we had already been really focused on DEI, so it all tied together. But it was amazing to me that we had folks that were like, I come from a police family, and this makes me really uncomfortable. And we're like, we're not saying anything about the police. We're just saying we stand with this group of people. So we have to be really thoughtful and measured about what we say and how we say it. If we move forward to more recent times, when the Roe v. Wade stuff was just happening, we took a pretty big stance on not making a comment politically, which personally I would love to do, but it's not appropriate in the office, but instead just said, look, like, this becomes about the health and wellness of our people. And this is what we're providing people. Like, everyone gets the same quality of care. If you can't achieve that in the state that you're living in because of things have tweaked, we will provide monetary support for you to be able to get the care that you need. And then we went so far as to say, we'll provide relocation support if you don't feel safe in the state that you're living in based on these things. And that was a very easy thing for us to say. We just made it about health and wellness as opposed to taking a political stance. You could probably read it and understood where we stood, but we find that if we focus on sort of the bigger picture issue, that we're staying true to who we are. But it's a very, very difficult road to navigate. And leading up to when we made a statement about it, I had people slacking me. Like, we live in a really interesting world now where, like, people I've never met before will slack me and say, just a heads up, depending on where Rapid7 comes out on this, I may or may not stay in my job. I may quit. Not telling me where they stood, but just like threatening their job. And I'm like, what do you say to that? Like, duly noted. And at the end of the day, we're going to do what we think is the right thing for our people and for our company. But I find it fascinating that people are turning so many of the things that are happening in the world into a statement of where they stand in their company and things like that. Honestly, if the economy changes and jobs become harder to come by and, whatever, I think it will be really interesting to watch people make a shift where these younger folks, for example, are in their first or second job and they have been holding all the cards for the last couple of years. Like, to see young tech people who have 6 months of experience commanding 250, 300 grand, saying, hey, this is how I'm going to work, like or don't, and companies have had to deal with that. I don't think that's going to last forever. I think the tide has got to turn at some point, and we'll kind of meet back in the middle at some place, I hope.
Yeah. Well, Christina, I really appreciate your time and kind of walking us all through your background and some of the work you're doing at Rapid7. We close every episode with a lightning round to help the audience get to know you a little bit better. And we always start with music. So I'm checking out your Spotify playlist or wherever you stream music. Who will I learn your top 3 artists?
Oh, my top 3 artists, probably always the Rolling Stones are sort of on the background. And I have this one, like, songs that motivate me no matter where I'm at. It's not a particular artist, but I have my top 50 songs. And if I am ever like in need of some energy boost, I will throw on that playlist. And it's got the biggest smattering of everything from like classic rock to a little bit of rap to like old school stuff, maybe a little Elvis, like just random stuff. But I like random. I like diversity. I like, if I just listen to the Stones all day, every day, I'd hate them. So I like a lot of diversity in my life.
You've got to have that pump up list. That's an important playlist to be able to.
I probably listen to that multiple times a week.
We're going to switch to TV. What was your latest streaming binge?
Oh, latest. I rewatched Breaking Bad.
All the whole series?
The whole series.
Yeah.
The whole series. I will admit, I've definitely watched way too much TV or streamed way too much during the pandemic. And I went back to things that I saw in the beginning and then went back. So like rewatched Breaking Bad, rewatched The Sopranos. And so like good shows, you get more. I found that I got more out of them the second time around, and took deeper meaning in them, which is crazy, but yeah.
Well, you kind of understand the plot line, right? Then you can get into
And
more
you
of the
look for
nuance that you
different
probably
things.
missed the first time around.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to change careers. I know you've worked in HR your whole career. Dad gave you great advice. Now we're going to do something different. If you weren't in HR, what would you be doing?
Writing a book. I'm in the middle of writing it, but I like haven't finished it because I don't have tons of extra time. And when I'm disciplined, I make tons of progress. But if I was to leave my job today, I'd go sit in a cafe in Florence and finish that book. I can't see myself ever going back and like, I think this is my last at bat as a chief people officer, and I'll probably go back to consulting post this gig.
After you finish that book in Florence, because that sounds like not a bad way to spend some time.
Yeah.
And last question for you. Who is one HR leader who you admire and why?
Patty McCord. I think she's just says it like she means it. You know, she's not super politically correct, really insightful, and I think very authentic. So that resonates.
Yeah. Well, Christina, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I can't wait to read that book after you get that time in Florence.
Awesome. Thank you, Lars. I appreciate the time.